walking the serpentine path, following the footsteps of the ancestors, walking the serpentine path, making our way back home. Hey ya, hey, hey ya, ho, hey ya, hey ya, hey ya, ho. Hey ya, hey, hey ya, ho. Following the serpentine path. Life.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Serpentine Path podcast. My name is Claire Wowdy Yassid, and I will be your guide on the serpentine path of life. I'm a songkeeper, plant walker, storyteller, word weaver, artesana, visual and performance artist, daughter, granddaughter, sister, lover, student, and friend, among many, many, many other things. I've spent my life traversing through altered states of consciousness and find it fascinating to explore all the ways in which our modern culture has become almost entirely severed from our innate instinctual and intuitive ability to see beyond the veil of so called reality. In this podcast, I will be sharing my own personal stories and insights regarding all things related to plant medicine, the birth, death, rebirth cycle, ancestral reconnection, intergenerational healing, womb sovereignty and bodily autonomy, dream work, rites of passage and initiations, time travel, shape-shifting, dimension hopping, and the reclamation of our collective earth-based practices, all of which I consider to be portals into altered states of consciousness. I thank you with my deepest respect and humility for taking the time to open your ears, your minds, and your hearts to what it is that I have to share. The telling of one's story is an intimate and vulnerable experience. It is also, in my opinion, one of the most powerful, illuminating, liberating, and healing medicines that a person can offer to the world. Hearing the cadence in a storyteller's voice, their laughter, their tears, their tone, their pauses, their pain, their joy, their curiosity, and their heart's song is something that can only truly be experienced by way of oral storytelling. Thus, in honoring the storytelling lineages of all of our ancestors, I offer my story to you now. In another world, another time, another dream, we're all sitting together in front of a big fire, passing our visions across the flames and receiving the medicine in our hearts. So again, welcome to the serpentine path where the ancestors have called us back to. Let's start at the end and find our way back home together. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Serpentine Path podcast, or welcome back. I'm excited and also nervous about this week's episode because I am going to be talking about something that I've obviously been working through my entire 28 years of my life, which is whiteness. And I'm also going to be sharing about the experience of coming to terms with the loss of my European indigeneity. So, to give a little bit of context, I grew up in what is incorrectly referred to as the United States of America or North America, which many indigenous peoples refer to as Turtle Island, and there's also, I'm sure, 1,001 other native names for that territory. But all of my ancestors all come from Mother Europe. So I come from Celtic and Germanic peoples of Mother Europe. So I am from Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and England, and also France on the Celtic side. And then on the Germanic side, obviously Germany and Switzerland. And my ancestors first started coming over to what is called the United States as early as the Mayflower. I don't remember what date that is. I think it's like the 1600s, maybe. So around over 400 years ago, probably. And my most recent ancestors came over from Germany. So that's my mother's father's side. They all came over from Germany at the beginning of the 20th century. I believe it was like 1901 or 1902 was when my most recent ancestors came over from Europe. And I now live in the Colombian jungle in the region of Putumayo, which is La Puerta de las Amazonas, which means the door to the jungle, the door to the Amazon jungle, more specifically. And I've been living in the Kofan territory permanently for over a year now. But I've also been spending significant time in the indigenous communities of the Putumayo region for about 3.5 years now. So as I said, I'm really excited for this episode because living in an indigenous community for this long, which also isn't that long of a time, but it is also very long in the grand scheme of things, has been profoundly impactful in my own understanding of what does it mean to be indigenous. And not just in my conversations with the elders that I'm very, very, very lucky to be learning from, but also in conversations with myself and in conversations with my own ancestors who lost their European indigeneity and also who had their European indigeneity very violently stolen from them over multiple centuries / millennia of profound colonization and violence and rape and torture and murder and separation from the land, which is what it means to be indigenous. It means to be of a place. So when I think about my trajectory at this point, I have been, one, separated from my original European territories and original indigenous European ways when my ancestors ended up leaving, but their indigeneity had been taken from them long before that, centuries and centuries before that, actually. And then now, even more distance, I live in an entirely different culture, in an indigenous culture, but in South America as well. So speaking an entirely different language, being in the context of a Latin culture, being in the context of a Catholicized culture, whereas in North America, it's much more of a culture that was dominated by Protestantism versus Catholicism. So that also has a specific flavor of religious undertones or overtones. And there's like a lot in that soup for me. Being really, really far from my original peoples and my original ways. So I want to begin a little bit by talking about my experience of whiteness before I ended up spending so much time in indigenous communities here in South America. Growing up in the States, I think the conversations around race are very specific and very particular, understandably so, because the conversations that we have around race only have to do with what has been happening in the world in the past 500 years of European colonization and domination, the creation of race based on skin tone, um, obviously the experiences of enslaved African peoples being brought over to work on the plantations, both in, obviously North America, Central America, South America, the Caribbean, and then also the horrendous genocide of indigenous peoples of the Americas. So when I look at the United States and the conversations that we have, not just about race, but also about history in general, it's like we have this very strange cultural amnesia where, like, our concept of history begins 500 years ago when the first European colonizers set foot in this hemisphere. And so when I just think about my perception of who I see myself to be as a person of European lineage, it's almost as if my concept of self begins in like 1492 when Columbus first began colonizing this hemisphere. And that's really just what I was raised with as an American. This idea that history began 500 years ago, and this idea that white people, as the dominators, as the colonizers, as the oppressors, that is also when our history began. And I remember growing up and feeling entirely displaced from any concept of culture. I didn't know what culture was, and I couldn't name it at the time, obviously, but as I got older, I could really place this sense of deep longing and deep sadness and deep, deep pain on the fact that I could look around at other races. I could look at Black families and Black communities. I could look at Latin families and Latin communities, and I could look at Asian families and Asian communities. And more, as I learned, I could look at indigenous families and indigenous communities and say, like, they have culture. They have their traditional foods. They have traditional languages. They have traditional ceremonies. And they have traditional music. And they have some connection to their home country, even though they all live here now. None of them, or, a few of them, are originally from these territories, but many of them are from very far away on the other side of the world, and yet somehow they have still maintained their culture. And yet, I don't have that. And I remember, especially as I was getting older, and when I moved to New York City, and conversations around race were like in my face all the time, feeling just genuinely at my core very lost and very sad. Now, the fact of the matter is, I couldn't identify that sense of loss and that sense of sadness because, on top of that, what I was only capable of feeling actually was guilt and shame. Because, as I said, my perception of my history, it literally began only 500 years ago as an oppressor, as a colonizer, as someone whose ancestors enslaved people, as someone whose ancestors murdered people, as someone whose ancestors stole the territory of the original stewards of those lands, as someone whose ancestors destroyed nature in many ways, and as someone whose ancestors were, in my mind, just like these violent, horrible people who raped and murdered and tortured and killed and stole. And that was, I swear to God, like the only narrative of whiteness that I saw reflected to me anywhere in the United States context. And the amount of shame and guilt and profound anger towards my ancestors that I held was insurmountable. And so when conversations around race came up, there were only two ways that I could respond. One was from a place of obvious defensiveness, which I think many white people get into because our biggest fear is being seen as racist, or only being seen as a colonizer, or only being seen as a violent oppressor. So there's that part where we like want to defend because we're like, I'm a human being. Like, please, there's more to me than just that. I don't want to be seen as just that. Please don't throw that label on me. So there's the defensiveness, but then there's another side of it, which is how to say, like, essentially putting people of other races above me and saying, like, I'm the shitty white person. My ancestors did horrible things. I'm going to shut up. I'm going to know my place. I'm going to, pass the mic. And I'm just going to be like a good white person who doesn't cause any more harm. Those are like the two kind of responses. And actually, now that I'm thinking about it, there's the third response, which is the like virtue signaling supposed ally who wants to distance themselves as far as possible from whiteness by a few different things. One, by like being overly supportive, like almost obsessively supportive of people of other races, even if you don't necessarily agree with things that they're saying, even if you're not aligned with their views and their perspectives. But because they're not white, their opinion is automatically better than mine, right? So I'm going to be overly supportive of them. That's one part of it. And then the second part of it is attaching to any identity of oppression that I can get a hold of to essentially try to say, like, yes, I'm white, but I'm suffering too. And so if you've listened to the episode where I talk about my gender journey, it's called Releasing My Attachment to a Non-Binary Identity and Returning to the Medicine of Womanhood. There's a section in there where I talk about how one of the big reasons, and there are many reasons, but one of the big reasons that I ended up getting so aggressively attached to a non-binary identity was because I was trying to distance myself from an oppressor identity, specifically from whiteness, and specifically white womanhood, because white womanhood, it's layered, and it's charged, and it's heavy. And so those were like my three responses, right? Was like defensiveness, or putting myself down, like making myself inferior, or kind of latching onto any form of allyship and any form of shared oppression that I could find or create with people who have experienced racial oppression, wanting to like get as close to their experience as possible. And I was really deep in that for a long time. And like when I think about social justice culture on like Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, the conversations that are had within liberal spaces, within leftist spaces, within cancel culture, all of that, it's all of that rhetoric. It's all of that language. And it's constantly feeling so scared to say any goddamn thing. And I don't think that that's specific just to white people. I think that everyone feels that within that web of, I don't know even how to refer to it, like social justice, racial, gender, politic conversations, blah, 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 I don't know. You guys know what I'm talking about. However, I will say that as a white person, as a person of European descent, there was just this profound, profound fear all the fucking time, constantly, of being seen as racist. It was like the worst thing that I could possibly imagine, like someone calling me racist. And so doing everything that I possibly could to not be seen as that, and actually really overcompensating and doing crazy shit to try so hard to escape from the inevitable fate of someone at some point saying Claire is racist, or Claire said something racist, or Claire did something racist, whatever. Like, biggest fear. And I know that a lot of white people, if not all white people, feel this way, right? So I've been through a big process with race that mostly, no, I can't say it mostly started when I began spending time in indigenous cultures, but a deeper layer was opened up to me when I began spending time here in the jungle, in indigenous territories and indigenous communities. So I first spent time in an indigenous community with the Kamsa people of the Sibundoy Valley of Putumayo. And that was a beautiful experience and a very complex experience that I will touch on in future episodes, like kind of my introduction into indigenous cultures and my introduction particularly into the medicine of Jahe. But there were so many stark differences and stark contrasts, and I will speak about it in the ceremonial context, which was I saw a man, an elder in his community from his lineage who lived in his ancestral territory, spoke his ancestral language, and was still in connection to his ancestral ceremonies, his ancestral medicines. And it was very clear that he was a steward of the land. So he lived like 4 hours deep in the jungle, like climbing through mud up to your knees kind of vibes to get to his beautiful home in the mountains. And he would just walk through the jungle with like a baby on his back and a machete in his hand and would just slash through the jungle, clearing the way for people, and just walked. And he knew the territory like the back of his hand because he had grown up there and that was his home and that was the home of his ancestors. And you see the comfort that he felt. And here I am, this white woman, like totally out of my element, just like, what the fuck am I doing? And seeing this man so at peace in his ancestral home. And then in ceremonies, obviously, Jahe is not an ancestral medicine for me. And so it's a very foreign context, the first time drinking and meeting the medicine of Jahe, meeting the spirit of that plant, meeting the altered state of consciousness that it creates, and also meeting the spirits of the jungle, meeting the animals, meeting the plants, meeting the rivers, meeting the topography of the terrain, the mountains, the jungle, everything. It's an entirely new world. And then seeing the familiarity and the comfort of the man who was serving the medicine because it's his culture and it's his lineage and it's his territory and it's his medicine and it's his ancestors who are working through him. And he's just the channel for all of that to come forth. And it's so funny to me because I've mentioned on the podcast that when I drank Jahe for the first time, the moment that the medicine touched my lips, the moment that I tasted it, I thought to myself, I'm going to drink this medicine for the rest of my life. This is my path. And that made no sense to me at all. I felt very out of my element, totally lost, like in this very, very unfamiliar place, totally foreign. And yet, there was something that was just like, oh my God, I'm home. I'm home. This is the most normal, comfortable thing for me ever. And what I will say about that is that it's not like I'm not going to sit here and claim, oh, in past lives, I was indigenous to the jungle and blah, blah, blah. A lot of people say that. Who's to know if that's true or not? I have no idea. I'm not going to make any judgment or claims. But I'm not saying that about myself. But what I will say is that all of our ancestors, every single one of our ancestors, had their medicines, they had their indigenous languages, they had their indigenous ceremonies, they had their indigenous songs and prayers, and they had their ancestors, their connection to their ancestors, to their gods, to the spirits of the land, because that, again, is what it means to be indigenous. It means to be of the land, of a place. And so when I say that I felt completely at home within a ceremonial context. It wasn't necessarily the medicine of Jahe. I love Jahe. I absolutely love Jahe. It has been one of the greatest gifts of my life to find my path with Jahe. But more than anything, the experience of ceremony has brought me back into connection with my understanding that all of my ancestors and all of your ancestors were at one point in time indigenous peoples, and we were at one point in time ceremonial peoples. So fast forward a few years down my path with Jahe, and I did a lot of exploring with medicine. I'm going to speak about it in a future episode. All of the interesting choices, and I wouldn't say mistakes, but I would definitely say things that I wouldn't do again on my path. All of the learning opportunities. Fast forward to when I began spending time in this specific part of the jungle with the Kofan people and with my teacher, Abuelo Kirawin. So, as I've mentioned before many times on the podcast, Abuelo Kirawin was the leader of his people, of the Kofan people, but he was also the spiritual and political authority of the medicine of Jahe in all of Colombia. He was 110 years old when he died. He traveled all around the world as both a political and spiritual authority of this medicine, but also as a political and spiritual leader when it came to many different conversations around health and well-being, particularly of indigenous peoples, of human rights, of ways in which we can better support actions against climate change. He was something else. Listen to the episode that I recorded about him, Padre de Todos. I explain all of this. But Abuelo was my teacher. And Abuelo was also the first person who I can genuinely feel looked at me and obviously saw my skin, obviously saw my whiteness, and also looked at me and just saw my spirit. So I've spoken a lot about both Abuelo and Abuela, but I'd love to share a little bit about this one conversation that I had with him and my partner Vincent. And it was around the time that he was dying, like a few months before he died. And Abuelo always spoke very honestly and very truthfully about his experience with blancos. So to clarify, in the indigenous culture where I am in South America, in the jungle territories, blancos are not just people with white skin like myself. Essentially, anyone who was not raised in indigenous territory in their indigenous lineage is considered a blanco. So that could be even a Colombian person who has brown skin, who you would look at and would say, like, they're Latin or they're mestizo, like they're mixed in terms of having indigenous lineage and blood from the Americas and also indigenous lineage and blood from Europe. They refer to those people also as blancos, which is very interesting. So Abuelo was always very open with everyone about his experience with blancos and about what his family and ancestry and lineage and peoples and territories and culture have been through in relationship to los blancos, the white people, colonizers, specifically like the Catholic monks that would come in, the Catholic schools, all of that. Abuelo told me many stories about all of his experiences. However, there was this beautiful day where Vincent asked him, because he was telling us some of these stories, and Vincent said to him, Abuelo, in your life, in your 110 years of life, did you ever feel anger towards los blancos, the white people who came in and stole your territory and murdered your people and took your medicines and colonized you and Catholicized you and called your people devils and demons, and saying that you were working with like evil forces and all of the horrendous racist things. Did you ever hate them? Were you ever like rageful, like angry at them? And Abuelo, really, without even skipping a beat, truly, without even skipping a beat, just said, no, never. I always just wanted to find solutions. And it was this beautiful moment because he was just like, I always just wanted to understand how we could work together. I never hated them, and I was never angry. I just wanted to understand. Now, Abuelo is very special because Abuelo Kerubim was pure love, the purest love. He was a master. Again, listen to the episode that I did specifically about him to learn more. But he is not representative of all Indigenous peoples because I spend all of my time with Indigenous peoples and I have seen many different visions and perspectives and feelings towards Blancos. There are many people who, understandably so, still do feel genuine anger and hatred towards Blancos, towards white people. There's also Indigenous people who have a lot of different thoughts about also negros, black people, or Asians, who they just refer to as chinos, even if those Asian people definitely don't come from China. That's also a very strange thing when it comes to race in Latin America and the terms that they throw around, which from a US perspective is absolutely not politically correct, but it's what they say. And so there's many, 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 many different experiences, obviously, of race here. I don't want to paint all Indigenous people from this region as being people who are like totally all forgiving and open hearted and at peace with white people in particular, but people of all races in particular, because they're human beings and they have a right to whatever experiences and perspectives and feelings and visions that they have. In the same way that any person of any other race has a right to their lived experience as well. But as I said, Abuelo Kiruin, I swear to God, I feel in my heart that he was the first person who I feel looked at me and just saw me as a child of God. And spending so much time with him and having him really treat me as his daughter, someone that he loved deeply, someone that he took care of, someone that he protected, someone that he instructed and offered orientation and guidance and advice to, was truly one of the most profound experiences that I have ever had in terms of transitioning my perspective of what it meant to be someone that people would refer to as white. So I want to speak about the word white in general, and also the term people of color. And this shift that I had in my mind, because I read this incredible book that I cannot recommend enough. It's called Grandmothers Counsel the World, and it's a collection of stories and guidance and prophecies from 13 different grandmothers from all around the world, Indigenous grandmothers, and also grandmothers who would not technically be considered Indigenous. And there's this amazing story in that book that comes from the Lakota people of what is now referred to as North and South Dakota in what is now referred to as the United States. And they speak about a creation story from the Lakota people, where essentially there was, at one point in time, this woman called the White Buffalo Woman, who came to her people with the medicine wheel. And the medicine wheel is this big circle with 4 quadrants that have 4 different colors on them. And the 4 different colors are meant to represent the 4 different colors of humanity. So the first color is the color black. And in this cosmology, the people with the black skin were the guardians of the water. The next people were the yellow-skinned people, and they were the guardians of the air. The next people were the red-skinned people, the guardians of the earth. And then the last color of humanity was the white-skinned people, and they were the guardians of the fire. And so the Creator took all of these 4 colors of humanity, and the Creator spread them out across the world. And the Creator said, you are all going to learn how to master your element. So again, for the black-skinned people, you are going to be the masters of water. The yellow-skinned people, you will be the masters of air. Red-skinned people, masters of the earth. White-skinned people, masters of the fire. And at some point in human history, you will all come back together and you will share with one another what you have learned about your specific element that you are now the master of. You will offer that to all the other colors of humanity. You'll reconnect. And it will be the white-skinned people, the guardians of the fire, who will prompt this coming back together again. They will be the leaders in the reconnection of all of the colors of humanity. And so I read this book, and I read this prophecy, this cosmology, this origin story from the Lakota people. And it shifted so much for me in terms of not seeing myself as someone with any color. And when I think about the word color, what comes up? Well, color invokes like vibrancy. It invokes life force energy. I think about all of the colors of the earth. I think about the greens and the purples and the reds. I think about the yellows. I think about the color black, the color gray. I think about the sky. I think about the rain and the rivers and the waters. I think about all that life force creation energy when I think of color. And then when I think about the way in which we speak about different races, and we refer to everyone who's not white as a person of color. And then as white people, just as white. The absence of color, the absence of life force energy, the absence of creative potential. We don't get a color, and we don't get the ability to color the world with whiteness. Because the ways in which whiteness has painted the world in the past and currently still in the present is through systems of white domination, systems of capitalism, systems of land exploitation, genocide, enslavement of other colors. All of that is what whiteness is associated with, what whiteness has been created into and even created by and for white-skinned people. That's what we have done thus far with the color that we have given, or at least that's all that I can see. That's all that I've known. That's all that I can understand of my color of whiteness. And so remembering myself as one of the colors of humanity, one of those 4 colors, and obviously there's 1,001 different skin tones. We're just speaking specifically about this creation story from the Lakota people. But remembering that I am a member of the colors of humanity and that I have a role, that I have a place in things, that I am not separate, that I am not devoid of creative life force potential, but that I too belong to a color. That was a beautiful shift. for me. And it was also fascinating learning about this creation myth because, sorry, I don't want to call it a creation myth because myth sometimes denotes like falsity. This creation story. And the idea that it was the white colored people, the masters of the fire, that were meant to be the catalyst to bring everyone back together. And so when I look at the history of the world, particularly within the past 500 years, I'm going to stretch it out in a little bit. But when we just look at the past 500 years, the way in which the United States chooses to look at race relations, all of the shame and the pain and the trauma of being that oppressor race that left my homeland and came to dominate and colonize and commit genocide and enslavement all across the world. When I heard about the fact that it was the white colored people that were meant to be those reconnectors, I can tap into my ancestors and all of their distorted and warped and traumatized ways of thinking, but also their deep core understanding that we have a responsibility to reconnect the world. And so, while obviously the way that my ancestors did it was not ideal, like, come on, let's be fully transparent about this, there's also a perspective in which you could look at it and say, and my ancestors did feel a calling to reconnect and did remember their responsibility as the white colored people to be those bridges and reconnectors and to call the rest of the world back together, to bring all the colors of humanity back into conversation and into communication once more. So as I said, I want to stretch out the timeline now from that 500 years that we always think of, and from that starting point of white European people, and to go way, 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 way further back in my lineage. So, again, as I mentioned, coming into a ceremonial way of life here in the jungle with kind of like my adopted lineage, the Kofan lineage that has brought me in and that has so graciously taught me and welcomed me and loved me and cared for me and protected me and oriented me. It brought me into the understanding that we were all once indigenous, which means of a place. We all once belonged to a specific territory. The territory did not belong to us. We were the stewards, the caretakers, the defenders, the guardians, but we were never the owners. The land, it didn't own us, but we lived in reciprocity and we belonged to that place. So one, we were all once indigenous to somewhere, including all white people. We were all once indigenous. And two, we were all once ceremonial. We all once had our medicines, our songs, our languages, our creation stories, our ancestors, our gods and goddesses, our land spirits, water spirits, nature spirits. We all once had all of our traditional ways. And so something that prompted this reawakening for me, not just in the context of ceremony, but in the context of an incredible book series that I was introduced to, which I would love to be the one to potentially introduce you to, which is called the Boudica series by this incredible author named Amanda Scott, who is Scottish. And it is the fictionalized dreaming and imagining and weaving of the story of the colonization of the Celtic peoples. So again, the Celtic peoples existed throughout the European continent as well as what are now referred to as the British Isles, and that's a big part of my ancestry. When I tell you, these books opened a door for me that I didn't even know was waiting. I had no idea was even there. for me. And the reason why is because Manda Scott has this capacity to dream and imagine and weave the fabric of a potential version of indigenous Celtic ways of life that woke up something in me that just thinking about it, I get teary-eyed, I get choked up, I get so moved. Because she gave voice to the history of colonization of my peoples, some of my peoples, because I'm also from the Germanic peoples. And obviously, so much of it is fictionalized because the fact of the matter is the history of my peoples has been entirely erased, but like entirely erased. We know so little about indigenous Europe, and it's only written from the perspective of the Roman colonizers. So in reading these books, because there's 4 of them, and I don't even know how many times I've read through the series at this point, at least 3 or 4 times, maybe more, there was something that unlocked within me where I started to reconnect to my experience of being someone of indigenous European lineage, of being someone who, when we speak about the Celtic lineages, who came from the Druids, the Celtic shamans, the dreamers and the seers, the singers, the healers, the people who traversed through altered states of consciousness, the people who communed with the gods, the people who scared the fucking shit out of the Roman Empire, the Roman legions, the people who waged war on Rome. And it was not the warriors that waged the war, it was the druids, the shamans, the wisdom keepers, the medicine men, and the medicine women, who were the people that the Roman emperors were scared shitless of. And you can read about it in a lot of the texts of that time. So I want to take a moment now to share a little bit about some beautiful pilgrimages that I've made to my ancestral territories. So I believe I was like 19 or 20 years old. I think I was 19 when my family, my mother and my father and my 2 sisters, we took a trip to England and Wales for about 2 weeks. My mother had spent a lot of time in Wales and in England when she was like in her late teens, early 20s. And my dad had also spent a little bit of time in London. And so we went to 2 specific places that unlocked something very strong for me. One of which is we went to Stonehenge, which is like a very classic tourist thing. However, Stonehenge is incredible and those standing stones are profound. And the funniest thing happened when we were at Stonehenge. If my littlest sister is listening to this, or anyone in my family is listening, they'll know what happened, which was we were at Stonehenge and we were in the kind of museum part. And my littlest sister was like looking over at me, and I was standing right next to a figure that I literally, no joke, thought was like a reimagining, like a wax figure reimagining of a traditional quote unquote Neolithic indigenous European woman of like the Stonehenge time. She was this woman who was probably, like her crone years. She was an elder. She was a grandmother with long red hair. She had this gorgeous long green dress and this staff that had, I remember so clearly, this elk or like deer kind of figure that was carved into the head of the staff. And she was standing right next to me. And I, again, completely thought that this was a wax figure. And it was my sister who noticed. She was like, "What is going on? This woman is staring at Claire." Just staring at her. And I realized that this woman was blinking. This wax figure was blinking and breathing. And I was like, what? But she was just staring at me really peacefully and really calmly with like this small kind of like knowing smile on her face. And I was like, what? And it was like a running joke in my family for a long time, but there was also something like very real and very serious about it to me of like, I just met a time traveling ancestor who was probably me in another lifetime. And then the other thing was when we then went to Wales and we were on the island of Anglesey. And when I got to Anglesey, in my spirit, I felt so at home. I had never in my life felt at home anywhere in the specific like territory to the land. On the island of Anglesey, I felt at home, and the woman who welcomed us into her home said to me, the wind was like whipping my face, the sky was gray, and there was rain, and it was like dramatic as hell. And I was just like loving it. And she said to me, she said, welcome to Anglesey. It's a place where you can't be half alive, is it? You're either alive or you're dead here. And I was like, yeah. Oh my God, yeah. And it was my favorite place that we had been to the entire time that we were in England. And it was fascinating to me because it was years later that I then learned that the island of Anglesey was also referred to as the island of Mona, which was where all of the druids, the Celtic shamans, went to train and to receive all of their teaching. So what united all of the Celtic peoples was that they sent all of their young warriors and shamans to the school on Mona to be trained. All of their strongest shamans and warriors were sent to Mona to be trained. And the warrior training, I think, could last somewhere between like up to 10 or 12 years. And the shamanic training was somewhere between 12 to 20 years. And so I was on the island of Anglesey, the island of Mona, feeling my cells just alive, like feeling something in my body just turning on and being like, holy shit, like, here I am. Oh my God, like, wow, wow. And I didn't know anything about the history of this island. I had no idea, right? And so for years, I felt this awakening in me that had come from being in my ancestral territories. I felt something stirring within me. And when I was, 21, after I had started getting visions, I started getting visions at 20. And when I was 21, I started getting these visions of this figure coming to me, this red-headed woman in a beautiful white dress with very pale white skin. And the visions would always begin with me on a cliff, on this big, beautiful cliffside with gray skies and wind and rain sprinkling down on me and a storm brewing and like gray, dark blue water and just the lush green of the territory. And I would be dancing and dancing and dancing. And then this figure, this woman with the red hair and the white dress, she would come to me. And then we would spin and we would spin and I would become her. And I would have visions of this over and over and over and over and over again in dreams. And she never said anything and I never got any information, but I was just becoming her time and time and time again. And then at a certain point, I met the medicine of rapé. For those who don't know what the medicine of rapé is, it's a medicine traditionally from Brazil that's a tobacco snuff that you blow up your nose or you have blown up your nose from someone else. But a friend introduced me to the medicine of rapé. And when I took rapé for the first time, I had a full-blown 20-minute psychedelic trip where this woman, this spirit, this ancestor came to me and she joined me and she became me. And then she said to me, Claire, come to Ireland. Everything will make sense. And I was like, what? She just said, come to Ireland. And I was like, what? And she was like, just come. Everything will make sense. And then randomly, that same night, I somehow kind of like accidentally ended up doing this past life reading, which who's to say anything about past lives? And sometimes I think that like psychic chicas like that are a little bit loco. But it was interesting because she said to me, all of your past lives have been in Ireland and Wales, almost all of them. And you have been a village healer and a wise woman and someone who works with plants and an elder in all of those lifetimes that you lived there. You had a few lifetimes in other places around the world, but the majority of them have been in those territories. And I was like, what? Like, I'm not a healer. I'm a dancer. I'm an artist. I'm going to be famous, blah, blah, blah. And she was like, no, like, your path is with the plants. You need to reconnect to that. And I was just like, no, I was not interested at all. I was totally like shut off from that. So months later, that was in January. Months later, I think in like May, I had totally forgotten about all of this. I was busy with other shit. And I was meditating one night and this woman came to me again. She came back and I hadn't seen her in months. And she said to me, Claire, it's time to come to Ireland. Everything's going to make sense. And I said, I can't. I am absolutely broke. I got no money. I don't even know how I'm going to pay rent next month, much less like food for the week. Like, I can't. And she goes, are you sure about that? And I said, yep, pretty sure. I checked my account at Trader Joe's today. Had like $12. And she was like, are you really sure? And I said, yeah. And she was like, just check. And I checked my bank account and I had, I think, around $8,000. And I was like aghast. I was shook. I was like, what? And I was like checking and trying to make sure that I wasn't freaking hallucinating. And I was just like, what? And I went to bed. I was just like, I don't understand. And she came to me in my dream again and she said, come to Ireland. And I woke up the next morning and it was like my hands like were magnetically pulled to my computer and I checked my bank account. And again, I had the money and I searched everywhere to try to see where it had come from. I couldn't find a single source. I was so confused. I was like, what? And essentially the spirit was like, you have no excuse, buy the ticket. And so I did. And I went to Ireland and that spirit was right. Everything started to make sense when I went back to my ancestral territory. So, for those of you who might not have any connection to Ireland, or maybe do but have never been there, it is absolutely magical. And it is one of the most beautiful places in the entire world. And it's one of the places where I have ever actually felt at home, like truly, truly at home, belonging, this sense of belonging. Because it was like when I arrived, all of my cells, all of my ancestors could breathe and could recognize where we were. We looked at the hills and we looked at the cliffs and we looked at all the farm animals and we smelled the grass and the herbs and the plants and the rivers and we just said, we're home. And I worked on a farm for like 2 weeks with these amazing Irish women, one of which was talking to someone one day, this woman from New Zealand who she herself was not indigenous to New Zealand. She was not Maori. And she was talking about what it was like to be a non-indigenous person in New Zealand. And the woman, the Irish woman, was like, wow, yeah, that's really interesting to like not be indigenous to where you're from, you know? We're indigenous to Ireland. And it was the first time that I had heard a white person refer to themselves as indigenous. And there was the part of me that was like, no, you're not indigenous. And then I was like, but wait, yes, she is, because her family has never left this land. They are of this land, and you could feel it in them. They knew the land so deeply. They knew all of the trees. They knew all of the herbs, all of the fruits, all the vegetables. They knew all of the animals and the birds. They knew the rivers. They knew the bogs. They knew the land, and the land knew them. And so she referred to herself as indigenous. And I was like, she's right. She's right. She's of this place, you know? And so after I left that beautiful farm, I then rented a car and I went to all of these different sacred sites, these Celtic sacred sites. And it was one of the most beautiful experiences of my life because I was going to all of these Neolithic, indigenous European sites, Celtic sites, where my ancestors had built these unbelievably complex structures that were aligned with the sun and the stars and the moon and the seasons and the equinoxes and the solstices, but like perfectly. And I literally could not comprehend how indigenous Europeans, who apparently were very like primal and uncivilized and unadvanced, how they could have possibly created something that was so exact and so perfectly aligned with nature. And I remember just being in awe, like just awe of my ancestors. Like, holy shit, you guys were so connected. You were so wise. You were so powerful. You were so indigenous to this land. You knew this land like you knew your soul, because this land was your soul and your soul was this land. And so I remember every time that I went to a new site, there's like over 200 indigenous Celtic sites in Ireland alone. And I was going to all of these sites, and just every time it was like my cells were coming back online, my body was coming back online, everything was just falling into place. And I was remembering who I was and who my people were, who my ancestors were. And I finally felt at home in my body and in my blood. It was unbelievable, you know? It was just unbelievable. And everything did make sense finally, and everything changed for me. The biggest change was that when I got back to the States, I ended up finally leaving my long-term abusive relationship, which my ancestors were the ones who pretty much got me out of it. And I'm going to do a whole episode about that. But that was the first time that I understood the concept of ancestors. Literally, it was the first time. I was, I guess, 22 years old. It was the first time that I understood that I had ancestors, and not just like grandparents or great grandparents, but I had ancestors that went back thousands of years, who were wise, who were kind, who were connected to the earth, to their lands, to their territories, to their ceremonies, to their songs, all of it. I have that, as we all have that. And there's this thing in people of European lineages where we have this strange, like, cultural and historical amnesia that we were all once of a place, that we were all once indigenous. And something that an amazing educator, Rochelle Garcia Saliga, something that she speaks about often and something that she just wrote about that very much inspired me, I'll link the essay in the show notes, is that this huge cultural amnesia that European people, European descendants have, doesn't just come because we chose to forget. This came from centuries and centuries and centuries and centuries and centuries and millennia of trauma that happened to our ancestors. So I've spoken a lot about my Celtic lineage, right? I want to speak a little bit about my Germanic lineage now, because I've been working through a lot of stuff with my Germanic lineage. The Germanic peoples were also very violently colonized by the Roman um, the Roman Empire. One of the most famous stories about the Germanic colonization and also Germanic resistance is the story of Arminius. So, for those who might not be familiar with the story of Arminius, Arminius was essentially a Germanic man whose father was like one of the Germanic war chiefs. and chiefs of his people, who, when the Romans came in, the Romans took the sons of a lot of these Germanic chiefs as like a, what is the word? It's not like a tribute to Rome, but as like a peace agreement, essentially. Like, we have your son, and so you will not fight against us. So Arminius was stolen, kidnapped, taken from his peoples, from his father, from his lineage, and from his birthright as the next leader of his people. He was brought to Rome, he was educated, and he was put into the Roman legions, essentially. And when the Roman legions went back to Germania, what it was called, or Germania, I don't know how they referred to it at the time. When they went back, he was brought back with his adopted father, and he was then put in charge of his people again, but he was meant to be like doing it from a Roman power standpoint. However, Arminius went back and he was like, fuck y'all. I know who I am, I know who my people are, and we're going to destroy you, which is what they did. There is this very well known story of how Arminius basically tricked the Roman Empire and the Roman legions that were there, and he brought them into the territory. I believe the forest is called like Teutoburg Forest. He brought them into this forest of his ancestral territory, his indigenous Germanic territory, and he organized the warriors of his peoples to demolish this Roman legion and to murder his adopted father, adopted Roman legion officer father. And there was a huge resistance of the Germanic peoples for a very long time, right? And so learning that story of the Germanic occupation of the Roman Empire, the Germanic oppression and colonization that occurred, and to also learn too about the Germanic shamans or wise women in particular that were called the seeresses. And these were people within the indigenous Germanic cultures who were seen as healers and diviners and, yeah, seeresses, soothsayers, people who could tell the future and people who were connected to the Germanic gods. There were even some Germanic seeresses who went all the way to Rome, to the Roman Empire, to the capital, to speak to the emperors. And the emperors were like fascinated and obviously terrified of these women because it was only a woman's role to be these divine shamanic mouthpieces, essentially, of the gods. And so I also learned all of the stories about that as well. And knowing that on both sides of my family tree, with my Celtic and with my Germanic peoples and ancestry, I have access to that innate wisdom of the connection to the gods, the connection to nature, the connection to shamanic practices of my lineages, right? Now, something that I find very fascinating about my German ancestry is that I have been extremely resistant to opening up to it. And it's taken me a long time to figure out why, because for forever I've been really open and excited about my Celtic ancestry, right? Even though, like, English and Scottish and French people were the ones who did the majority of colonizing in the quote unquote New World, I was like down with my Celtic ancestors. There was something about them that felt accessible and felt clean and felt like there wasn't shame associated, and I felt pride with my Celtic side. With my Germanic side, I was like, fuck no. And I even spent time, it's funny, I even spent a lot of time in Berlin when I was younger. I was considering moving to Berlin, and then the pandemic happened, and I ended up in South America, which is about as different from Berlin as you could possibly get. But there was something about Germany and German culture and my German ancestry that I had such a block around. And it was only recently, really recently, within the past few months, that I realized was this huge, huge gap in my understanding of ancestors, which is just because I had ancestors that came over to Turtle Island does not mean that I also don't have ancestors that stayed in Mother Europe. Because, for example, on my grandfather's side, my mother's father's side, the last people to come over in my family to Turtle Island, there was one man and one woman who came over, and they left the entire rest of their family behind. So I guess that was my great great grandfather who came over, right? Now, he and she, my great great grandfather and great great grandmother, left their entire family in Germany, which means that whole side of my family is very likely still in Germany, or maybe they've gone to some other part of the world, right? But they all stayed there. And same with all of my other ancestors. They had family members who stayed in their indigenous European territory when they left. And so just because I have ancestors that came over does not mean that I don't have ancestors and family and blood and cellular connections that are still very much in Mother Europe still. So when I'm focusing on Germany in particular and the huge block that I had around connecting to my German gifts, I look at the Holocaust. And I also look at Soviet occupation, and I look at the Berlin Wall, and I look at the trauma that Germany has gone through in this past century. And I can feel now and understand the profound degree of shame that ancestrally I have taken on because I still have family in Germany. They're distant family, but they are still my blood. And they have been through all the traumas of World War I, World War II, the Holocaust, Soviet occupation, division of the country, all of that I have experienced on a cellular and spiritual and blood level because they are my blood. There's no disconnecting me from what's happening in my home country. All of this was really coming up for two reasons. One, I have a wonderful friend named Amma who I want to have on this podcast at some point in the future, who has been opening me up to what is called German New Medicine and also referred to as Germanic healing knowledge. And for a long time, she would share this with me, and it did make sense. And I had a huge resistance to it, literally because of the word German. And I didn't realize consciously that that's what it was, but that is what it was. The concept that it was a lineage from Germany, I was like, no, Germans don't know shit. Like, that's what was going on in my mind. So that's the first thing that I can really pinpoint. Second thing that I can pinpoint is I've had a wonderful friend that I've been spending time with over the past few months. Hi, Sabine, if you're listening. Love you. Who is German. And she's spoken to me and shared a lot with me about what her experience was being German. And just the shame and the guilt and the self-loathing and self-hatred of what it means to be a German person. And in these conversations with her, also with another man, Kevin, if you're listening to this, who is Swiss. I also have Swiss ancestry, which is, I would consider to be like Germanic, right? The lineage of the Swiss people. And all of the blockages that I had with them started crumbling because I realized, oh my God, I'm trying to pretend that I am not connected at all to World War I, World War II, the Holocaust, Soviet occupation, everything else that has happened in Germany and Switzerland. I am trying to pretend that my ancestors totally escaped from that. That's not true. I have many ancestors and many contemporary family members, distant family members, who have lived through that entire experience and they're alive in me. Their experience is my experience. I can't separate myself from Germany, from Switzerland. I can't separate myself from France, from England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales. I cannot separate myself from Mother Europe. She is the land that I am indigenous to, my blood, my cells. She is my mother. She is my territory. She is where I am from. And so working through all of these blocks and all of this genuine hatred that I have carried and felt in myself as a person of European descent has been profoundly beautiful. And it's also only been able to occur through my experience of living in an Indigenous community entirely separate from my own lineage, my own blood, my skin color, my languages, my culture, everything. Totally foreign, and also, in a way, the most normal and the most natural expression of humanity that I've ever experienced, because, as I've said 1,001 times, and I will say 1,001 times again, we were all once Indigenous, and we were all once ceremonial peoples who belonged to the land. And so I know that my path has taken me 1,001 different directions in coming back to my European indigeneity. However, it's been the most beautiful experience to recognize, like, yes, there are 1,001 true differences that cannot be blended over or seen as, like, I don't see color, or to, like, totally disconnect from the very sacred and very special specificities of each culture. And also, there's a beautiful, deep, embodied understanding of, I was once Indigenous, and I was once a person of ceremony, of a ceremonial way of life. I was once of the land, and I can be again. What does it mean to be Indigenous? To be of a place. What does it mean to be Indigenous? Well, a lot of things. But it means to be of a place. So what does it mean to learn the Indigenous names of the territory that I'm on? What does it mean to learn the Indigenous foods of this territory? To learn the Indigenous medicines of the territory, the Indigenous languages of the territory? And what does it mean to go into deep ceremony with my own ancestors and to ask them, please come to me. Please share with me who you were, who you are, who I am, who I was, who my people were, what was stolen from us. Show me my original tongue that I spoke in. Show me my original way of dressing. Show me the tattoos. Show me the body painting. Show me the feathers that we wove into our hair. Show me the animals that we dreamed with. Show me the medicines that we communed with. Teach me about the gods. Teach me about my people. And so in opening the door to another culture that's so different from mine, I also opened the door to understanding my own culture and to also really unlearning all of the shit that I have swallowed about whiteness. All of the lies of whiteness, all of the disconnection of whiteness, all of the loss of whiteness, all of the amnesia of whiteness, all of the trauma of whiteness. Fuck that. Fuck that. None of that is true. None of that is who I choose to continue being. The guilt, the shame, the anger, the self-loathing, the self-hatred, the violence that I turn in on myself, on my own skin, on my face, as a person of European descent. Fuck that. That's not who I am, and that's not who Mother Europe is. It's not who my ancestors are. At their core, they were people of the land. And they were people who were also oppressed, who were colonized, who were raped, who were murdered, who were forced into assimilation, who were ripped away from their families and forced into slavery. They were peoples who had all of their indigenous spiritual practices stolen from them. They were Christianized and Catholicized. My ancestors were forced through the Inquisitions and the witch trials, the healers, the midwives, the revolutionaries, the poor people who were murdered and tortured in front of their families and communities, who were lit on fire, who were burned at the stake, who were hung, who were drowned. The women who had their breasts cut off while they were being tortured by the state, by the church. The people who were forced into capitalism, the people who were taken away from their communal way of life in the commons, the people who were forced through Roman slavery for hundreds of years, the people who were forced through the Middle Ages and feudalism for hundreds of years, the people who were forced into capitalism and land exploitation, the people who were driven from their own lands across the ocean. No people leave their homeland, their ancestral territory, their indigenous lineage, unless they absolutely have to, unless something is pushing them so violently and so drastically and so traumatically. That's the only reason that peoples would leave. And so the question is, why did my ancestors leave? And why did my ancestors' sense of humanity and love and respect and integrity and honoring of human life get so warped and so distorted that they then could experience all of the horrendous and traumatizing things that they experienced in their own colonization, in their own oppression, in their own enslavement, and their own genocide? How could that have warped their spirits so drastically over hundreds and thousands of years that they had the ability to turn around and then do it to other people on another hemisphere and on other continents? That's the question that's interesting to me. It's not, oh my God, why are white people so horrible? The question is, why are white people in so much pain? What happened to us? What happened to our peoples? That's where I am interested in going now. It's not, oh God, how could we have done that? It's, oh God, I'm so sorry that it was done to you first and that you did not have any of the tools, any of the support, any capacity or ability to heal so that you didn't turn around and do it yourself. Ancestors, I'm so sorry. Ancestors, I love you. Ancestors, you didn't deserve that. Ancestors, how can we heal? How can we remember? That's what I'm interested in these days. And so when I think about the conversations of race that are had in the United States, again, that start with those 500 years and this full cultural amnesia, particularly of people of European descent, and the shame and the pain and the guilt and the trauma that we carry that we're truly not even aware of. We know nothing about our European history. Like we know kind of like the textbook stuff, but we don't know about what the fuck actually happened to our ancestors throughout those experiences of colonization, oppression, violence, torture, enslavement, rape, destruction of families, destruction of our indigenous ways of life. If we were to actually go into that pain, if we were to actually sit with it, the loss, the deep sadness, the profound, profound, profound disembodiment and trauma that we carry as people with white skin, people who have no color, apparently. If we were to really sit with that, everything, I think, would change. Because then we could start to understand that we're not different from anyone on this earth. Anyone who has gone through experiences of enslavement or genocide, anybody that has gone through experiences of oppression or colonization. We are not just people of a colonizer or oppressor lineage. I used to refer to myself as that, which I think is absolutely crazy. I used to say, oh, I come from a colonizer lineage. Okay, that's only taking into account the past 500 years. What about the 1500 years that I was colonized? What about the 1500 years that my peoples were oppressed, enslaved? What about all of that? Why does that get completely forgotten? And I'm not saying this to compare my experience as a European person, a white person, to that of someone who comes from an African lineage or from an indigenous lineage of the so-called Americas or an Asian lineage. I'm saying that to say, yes, I come from a lineage of colonization on both sides of the spectrum. I have been colonized and I have been the colonizer. My ancestors have been the oppressed and they have been the oppressors. And so to just refer to myself, oh, I come from a colonizer and oppressor lineage, how dare I disrespect my ancestors like that? How dare I forget their suffering, their pain, their experiences? And how dare I pretend that they just woke up one day and said, I think I'm just going to travel across the ocean, just kidnap a bunch of people with black colored skin, and then just, go murder a bunch of people with brown/red colored skin. I'm just going to go do that. They didn't just wake up one day and decide that. It took time. And it took a lot of violence to warp them to that point where they could get to that level of distortion and lack of connection to true godliness. A disconnection from God, truly. That's what it is at the end of the day. A disconnection from right relationship to thriving human life. My ancestors did not just wake up one day lost. There was a long process. And so that's what's interesting to me these days. And that's what I'm healing these days. And that's what I'm really grateful to be moving through these days. And I'm sure that I'm, again, barely scratching the surface. Something that's so beautiful is that my partner, Vincent, is French. And more, I know that I'm going to be spending more time in Europe again with him. It's really important that I can learn French because it's also one of my indigenous languages. It's important to spend time in French culture to me because I am a French woman. It's a big part of my ancestry. My name, Claire, is French. And so my partnership has brought me back into connection with my European ancestry as well. And I think that that's so beautiful that I have that. I'm really grateful for where I'm at when it comes to my perception of race and whiteness. This idea of whiteness. I'm really grateful to be reclaiming my understanding of what it means to be a European woman, of what it means to be a European woman that's been disconnected and disembodied from her Europeanness. I'm really grateful for the fact that I somehow came through to this understanding through an entirely different culture here in the jungle with the medicine of Jai, which is a jungle medicine. I think it's hilarious and I think it's incredible and I think it's beautiful and I think there's so much more work to be done. There's so much more healing. There's so much more unlearning and there's so much more remembering to do. So much more reclaiming of my ancestral gifts. So much more, but it's all so beautiful. So beautiful to no longer look at my white skin and to feel disgust, to feel shame, to feel hatred, to feel guilt, to just see myself as a violent, horrible colonizer and oppressor, but to be able to really see my own humanity. And in that, I can see the humanity of other people. because I no longer look at them and just think, oh God, my peoples colonized your peoples, my peoples murdered and oppressed and enslaved your peoples. I can look at other people of other races and say to them, you and I are really not so different. And in a deep, deep way, I can understand your pain. And it is different. And it's also the same. I'm a human being, just as you are. My ancestors have known colonization and oppression in a very similar and also very different way to you. But your story and my story, they're not so far away. And I love you. And as my teacher, Abuelo Kerouin, said, we can find solutions together. So let's do it. So to close, as always, I'll just share about what I'm going to be offering on the Patreon extended episode. So I want to share a little bit about the difference in my relationship to my ancestors versus the relationship that my partner Vincent has to his, just based on our discussions. And yeah, I guess the contrast that I see in someone who never left their ancestral homelands and then versus somebody like me whose ancestors did. And then the second thing that I'm going to share a lot about is like suggestions and offerings for people who are interested in reconnecting to their European ancestry. There's a lot of stuff in there. I'm not going to go too deep into it, but yeah, that'll be over on the Patreon. So thank you guys so much for all of your support and for listening.
Da-na-na.